Chinese are hardworking people, strong families, high savers, passionate about education. If China achieves half the per capita of the US, China's GDP will be that of the US and the EU combined. In the Western media, the prevalent view is China managed COVID terribly. There was confusion, there was overreaction, people were oppressed, and so on. In fact, China did extremely well. While the rest of the world was paralyzed, the Chinese economy continued to function. According to the WHO, per million, China had one of the fewest deaths in the world. For most of the world, we were at home, working or pretending to work, and looking forward to the parcels that came through our doors, and opening the boxes, and sometimes forgetting what we had ordered a few days ago. But usually with delight to find that, well, these are things we wanted. Well, who made the stuff in the boxes? They're all made in China. And that was at the heart of the supply chain crisis. China was producing for the entire world during that period. And all the ships were pulled to Chinese ports. I was in logistics. And the freight rates rose steadily from 1,000 to West Coast US to Europe, 1,500, 2,000. And the ships were told, do not take on cargo. The moment you unload the containers, come back. Then when rates reached $5,000, they were told, leave the boxes there, because the cost of a box is only $2,000. The critical deficiency were ships. And of course, in other parts of the world, rates went up because the ships were no longer there. In 2002, when Omicron appeared, the Chinese were not sure what it meant, because in Hong Kong there were many deaths. It turned out later that the deaths were mostly due to Delta, not Omicron. Then the 20th Party Congress was coming up. And the 20th Party Congress in the Chinese Communist Party is as important as a paper conclave. So they had to, for their own legitimacy, make sure that when the votes were counted, the hall was full. They were able to contain Omicron in Guangzhou, Shenzhen, but in Shanghai, because the Shanghainese thought they were superior and had better methods, it got out of control. The vice premier went down, Sun Chunlan, and told the party secretary, who is now the premier of China, he said, you stop it. The Shanghainese were traumatized. For 2-3 months, they were in jail, regardless of what they were doing. My Chinese friends outside Shanghai laugh at the Shanghainese. They had a comeuppance because they've always had a superior attitude towards Chinese from other parts of China. But just to give you a sense of how much China moved ahead, in 2021, China's merchandise trade surplus was $520 billion. In 2021, it went up to $670 billion. In 2022, when the rest of us thought that China was in turmoil, the merchandise trade surplus went up to $870 billion. Now in Europe, America, Japan, the printing presses were working 24/7 to provide the money supply which kept us all fed. And life was normal apart from physical deprivation of movement. But the guy beavering away at the corner, he was collecting all that money. And that's why Chinese money is now flowing out to buy assets in the world. In Singapore, we got a trickle. It's causing terrible asset inflation. 3-star restaurants have booked months in advance. Golf club memberships have doubled in Sentosa. The queue for Porsches, Lamborghinis, Bentleys, Rolls Royces, in the months, if you know the dealer. They've always understood pandemics. In their recorded history, there were over 350 pandemics going back to the period of the Warring States. On every pandemic or epidemic, they had detailed records, symptoms, progression, the remedies which were helpful, and so on. And the only assured way of controlling a pandemic is to lock down. Mathematically, you reduce the coefficient to below 1. So the old imperial capitals of Luoyang and Chang'an, which is now Xi'an, they were divided into cells. In an emergency, whether it is a threat of insurrection, an assassination attempt, fugitives to be caught, they would seal the cells. Then cell by cell, they would check. And in the palace itself, in the imperial harem, because the emperor would have many wives and many sons from different wives, it was critical that in the pandemic, they don't lose all the sons. If they lose all the sons, then the dynasty ends. So they have lockdown procedures in the harem. And every dynasty would have to go through 5 to 10 epidemics. There was nothing new to them. So when COVID struck, they knew what was the ultimate solution. Now for Chinese people, they may complain, they may cry blue murder like the Shanghainese did, but in the end they comply. Because it's socialized into the political culture, into the social instinct. But the foreigners were there, like the Europeans, they couldn't take it. They left. They couldn't take it. Because Chinese culture has its own quality. And it goes back a long time, without a break. When Europe was united under Rome, Republican and Imperial Rome, China was unified. But Chinese unification was based upon a historical, cultural, and philosophical inheritance which went back 2,000 years before that. Whereas when Rome was established, there was no such common philosophical basis in Europe. So you had Roman law. The first dynasty in China ruled by law. They were the legalists. It was so tough, the Chinese people couldn't take it. So after the first emperor established it by will, by force, his son could not carry on. And the next dynasty, the Han dynasty, decided you cannot use legalism to unify such a big country. You needed a moral code of conduct, which the Chinese called Li. And that while I remember reading Joseph Needham, while in China's history there was a bigger corpus of legislation than in European history, in the Chinese tradition, at the top, it is not law. It is not la legge e vigale per tutti. It is at the top. If the law results in an absurd outcome, then propriety takes over. This is Chinese thinking. Yes, never change. And even in Singapore, which is 3/4 Chinese, and we've inherited institutions from the British, people always feel that if you want to help, you can help. You should be flexible if the legal outcome is somehow perverse or not quite right. And the continuity of Chinese culture has created a larger nationality than any other by a long stretch in human history. No other nationality, no other race has as many members as Chinese people. Hey, Europe is diverse. Europe is interesting precisely because it's diverse. I was in Spain, now I'm here. Alex from Finland. I have Norwegian friends, Greek friends, Croatian friends. Europe is a collection of tribal nations. Yes, there is a common civilizational basis in Greece, Rome, and Judeo-Christianity. But the European people feel passionately their own individual identities. But for China, there's no such diversity because they had paper. They had paper as a monopoly for over 700 years. Now, paper as a form of storage, as a means to process information, is orders of magnitude greater than parchment or papyrus. So if you compare Han Dynasty records with Roman records, there's no comparison. There's no comparison. And it became the tradition in China that every dynasty will write the history of the previous dynasty. So today in China, there are 23 official dynasties. The last was of the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644. The history of the Qing Dynasty, 1644 to 1911, is today being written. The exercise began in 2003 and was launched by Vice Premier Li Lanqing, whom I knew as Trade Minister. And I remember him telling the scholars, do not rush to conclusion. Do not rush to conclusion. And at that time, they were thinking of 99 volumes, with 5 volumes on the foreign missions operating in China, like the Jesuits, the MEP, and so on. Then it became 250 volumes. I think it's gone beyond that. There's more material on the Qing Dynasty than on all the previous dynasties combined. Both internal records, provincial records, and foreign records. So paper enabled the development of an information-intensive society. So they were the first to record Halley's Comet. They recorded flood levels going back over 2,000 years. If you go to Chengdu, Joseph Needham wrote about it, at Duyanjiang. The same irrigation system developed over 2,000 years ago continues to operate, continues to keep Chengdu supplied with water and free of floods. Climate records, grain. And who were the programmers of that period? They were the scholars, because it took years for them to understand the language, to write it with a brush, and you can, on a brush, on rice paper, write much more quickly than monks could in the Benedictine monastery. I was just at Montserrat a few days ago and had a wonderful briefing about how the Benedictines kept records for the church, for Europe, for centuries. And in Switzerland, in places like St. Gallen, less ravaged by war, the most complete records of the period of that history. In the 8th century, the Chinese army in Central Asia was defeated by the Abbasids. And among the Chinese prisoners of war were a few who knew how to make paper. And so paper mills were established in Samarkand, Bukhara, Damascus back then. And Islamic civilization went through a transformation in the script and in the thinking, because then they had knowledge. So you had Avicenna and all the scholars of Greek history. By the year 1000, there were paper mills in Cairo. Year 1002, there were paper mills in Islamic Spain. And the Muslims wanted to keep it a monopoly, like the Chinese did. But it leached into Northern Europe, into Northern Italy. And so paper arrived in the 13th, 14th century. And that created the basis of the Renaissance. Now, this roll of paper in history is extremely important because you have in the Chinese people a willingness to share information which other cultures do not have. And China today has again become the most information-intensive society in the world. Many people don't realize that during the 3 years of COVID, China was not marking time. People were not at home playing with their computers. They were making things. So when they had the motor car show in Shanghai recently, Western companies, Japanese companies were shocked that in those 3 years, the Chinese auto industry surged ahead. And just a few days ago, China reported that it exported more cars than Japan. It already produces more cars than anybody else by a long shot. And for electric vehicles, they are way ahead of anybody else. And it's not just the cars, but what's in the cars. You know, in the West, because of security concerns, and because US intelligence agencies do not want to lose their monopoly of being able to surveil everybody, you ban Huawei, because Huawei could do the same thing. But in so doing, you have denied yourself of 5G. China today has, by the end of this year, we have 3 million base stations for 5G, all the way to the base camp of Mount Everest, which means that the average Chinese has much more bandwidth than the average American or European or Singaporean. And when you have bandwidth, there are products and services which young people can develop and experiment with, which others elsewhere could not. And this year, China will account for 35% of global growth. They talk about 5% growth. Economists say maybe 6%. Well, that might be too optimistic, but China will grow at more than 5% this year, and probably faster next year. And unlike in the advanced economies, where all that money printed is causing inflation to go up, in China, interest rates are trending down. Now, the other, in my view, I'm not a scholar, but just my observation, reason why Chinese civilization has such a deep continuity is because of the writing system. It is pictographic or ideographic and not alphabetic. If it's alphabetic, the words change with pronunciation, which changes naturally. But in a pictographic system, the value of the character doesn't change. So if you present a European high school student with something written somewhere in Europe 2,000 years ago, he can read it. You have to attend university to read it. A high school Chinese student can read what was written 2,000 years ago. And after a day explaining the phrases, the context, he can at least read it and begin to understand its meaning. And for a population twice that of Europe, there's only one literature. There's only one set of heroes, one mythology. Whereas in Europe, from the north to the south, from the east to the west, it is diverse. So each has its own nature. Each makes its own contribution to human civilization. The idea that the country is a large family is in the Chinese DNA. The country is described as a guoxia, a country family. And therefore, it needs a paterfamilias. It requires moral leadership. So in China today, when Xi Jinping or Chinese leaders make speeches, they are boring because they are all moral disquisitions. And you have to make references to the past, to precedents. And the information is in the nuance. I tell Alex, it's like reading paper encyclicals. There's a strange parallel between the Catholic Church and China, because both have long continuity, both requires detailed record keeping. One has a priesthood, the other has a communist priesthood. Both govern on the basis of moral assertions. Those who think that China is no longer communist are very badly mistaken, because they take their ideological, philosophical underpinnings very seriously. But it is not superficial Marxism or Leninism. It's Marxism-Leninism as interpreted in Chinese history. Now, I talked earlier about the dynastic histories, 23 of them. Mao Zedong read all of them repeatedly, made annotations with his usual scrawl. So you go to a Beijing bookshop, you can find the 23 dynastic histories with Mao Zedong's handwritten scrawls with what they meant and annotations on his annotations. And yet the last dynasty's history is not yet written. Now, I recount all this just to make a point that China is not easily understood. And the Jesuits, when they went in the 16th century, they knew this. My hero, Matteo Ricci, Chinese name Li Mato, he thought he should dress like a monk, only to discover that in China, monks are looked down upon by the scholars. But he had an encyclopedic memory, and probably one of the most brilliant men Europe has ever produced. So he mastered the Chinese classics. He put on the robe of a scholar. He helped the Chinese correct the calendar, maintain the clocks in the palaces, compared notes with them on astronomy. At that time, the Jesuits knew that in order to persuade China, to convince them, they had to go into the depths of Chinese philosophy. So just the translation of Deus into Chinese was very difficult, because China had no equivalent concept of an intervening God. When Francis Xavier went to Japan, he found a name which turned out to be that of a minor Japanese deity. So that wouldn't do. Matteo Ricci thought deeply. The Chinese have the concept of heaven. It's really a monotheistic idea, because there's only one heaven, and there's only one humanity. And the emperor is the son of heaven, Tianzi. And he governs on the basis of a mandate of heaven, Tianming. And Matteo Ricci's translation of God was the Lord of Heaven, Tianzu. Until today, the translation of the Catholic religion into Chinese is the religion of the Lord of Heaven, Tianzu Jiao. A Harvard scholar, an Orthodox Jew, showed me the catechism books produced by the Jesuits in the 16th, 17th century. They showed Jesus and Mary and the apostles as Chinese. As Chinese, because, you're not going to impress the Chinese people about ideas of God if they look like foreigners with big noses and different colored hair and so on. In the 19th century, when the missionaries had guns and gunboats, Jesus and Mary became European with blue eyes and blonde hair. Then it was seen by Chinese revolutionaries as a foreign religion and a threat. I mean, when Cortés went to Tenochtitlan, his advantage was the Aztecs had a myth that God would come from overseas and would be white. So once your God is a foreigner, the conquest is complete. And therefore, an essential part of the Chinese Revolution was the rejection of Christianity as a foreign religion. And the Chinese have repeatedly said that Christianity has to be sinicized, the way Buddhism after many centuries, was thoroughly syncretized in China to a point where even though Chinese people intellectually know that Buddhism came from China, they think of Buddha and the Bodhisattva Kuan Yin as Chinese, with whom they have a personal connection. Christianity will have to go through a similar transformation, and in a sense, going back to what it was in the 16th, 17th century. Pope Francis has no problem with that, because when he was in Mexico at the shrine of Our Lady of Guadalupe, and my wife had a miraculous cure which we attribute to the Virgin of Guadalupe. She had a terrible cancer, and they thought she was going to die. But after we prayed there, we went back. The next MRI showed that the tumor completely disappeared, and it was on the feast day of the Nativity of Our Lady. But that's an aside. Pope Francis said that Mother Mary had apparitions throughout the world, hundreds of them. But in only one apparition did she leave behind her image, and that was in Guadalupe. And that was of her as a mestiza. And when the Pope went to visit a Rohingya camp in Bangladesh, at Cox's Bazar, to comfort them, he said, God is Rohingya. When I addressed alumni of Peking University in Singapore at the 100th anniversary of the May 4th movement, I said, God is Chinese. Now, there was a stir in the audience. It is nothing new. The Jesuits understood this from the beginning, that in order to persuade, in order to attract, you must insert, you must inculturate. And only when you do that, when you're interested in me, I like you, because you're interested in me. If you're not interested in me, and all you want is to proselytize, I'm not interested in you. But if you're interested in me, my fears, my hopes, I find you very attractive. And that begins the process of persuasion, a chemistry. Between Europe and China, there was such a chemistry. But during the period of Western ascendancy, there was no longer any need for a chemistry because the interaction was by force. You're losing that force. But you continue to have many things to impart to the rest of the world. And it must be done not by proselytizing, but by being attractive. And you become attractive by being interested in others. And when you are, a process begins. The Chinese, we just had the G7 meeting in Hiroshima, and there were many statements which the Chinese found highly offensive because it asserted a China which the Chinese don't believe is a fair description. And they remember that of the 8 of the G7 countries, if you take away Canada and add in Austro-Hungary and Russia, these 8 countries were the ones who ravaged China in the infamous 8-country alliance in 1898. All Chinese people remember that, how they ravaged China and took away artifacts which are still in Western museums. So when the G7 makes these accusations, emotionally, there is a reaction. But they've decided that they are growing and that the China today is not the China of 100 years ago. In 2003, a big group of scholars produced a wonderful series in 12 episodes, each 45 minutes, called The Rise of the Great Powers, 大国崛起. And it began with Henry the Navigator of Portugal, and how this tiny nation at the end of the world at the end of the Reconquista, decided to go out, followed by Spain. And how in Tordesillas, they got the Pope to divide the world between the two of them, which was astonishing. Then they talk about Holland and how he created the joint stock company, which was a great innovation in global finance, the idea of limited liability. Of course, it accounts for many of our problems today too, but without limited liability, the modern economy could not have come about, and for which we have to thank the Dutch. The episode on France was fascinating because it began with a debate in the French Assembly about whether Alexander Dumas should enter the Pantheon. And Jacques Chirac weighed in. The commentator said, what country is this? What civilization is this? That there should be a national debate about a writer. On Russia, the episode began with Peter the Great witnessing the execution of his own son, to make the point that reform is dangerous business. And if you fail, you die. Great Britain had two episodes, in one of which they quoted Churchill when he said that Shakespeare is more important, more valuable to the empire than all of India. It was a reflection. The series was produced without rancor, almost with admiration, but with one purpose: to study, to learn, to avoid mistakes. So today, I would say that China's understanding of Europe is much greater than Europe's understanding of China. But to have a chemistry, it must be two-way. And institutions like the SDG should be a part of it, to continue in the tradition of Marco Polo or Matteo Ricci. The big question in the world today is a titanic contest between the US and China. The US is a relatively young country. The Chinese think that it's almost infantile because it's only 300 years. It's about the length of one dynasty. And to think that a piece of paper, the US Constitution, can forever define that society, they consider a bit curious. But still, it is big, it is powerful, it is almost frightening. The problem is this: the US believes that China will behave like an imperial power when it becomes big or bigger. Now, China's per capita GDP is about 20% of the US today. Now, it's not inconceivable that the per capita income in China reaches half that of the US, because the Chinese are hardworking people, strong families, high savers, passionate about education. If China achieves half the per capita of the US, China's GDP will be that of the US and the EU combined. Now, if you're in business, we say, oh, yeah, this is very important information, because it means that wherever you are, your biggest market, your biggest threat, your biggest opportunity will be China. And if that's the case, you better make sure that all your key people understand China. If not for offensive purposes, at least for defensive purposes. And it is on the cards. We may be, let's say, by 2050, 2060, 2070, we can be out by 10, 20 years. But without nuclear war, it's unstoppable. So this is the future we're talking about. And by 2050, given demographic trends, %30 of the world's population will be African, 40% Muslim, and by 2050, maybe 1 in 2 babies will be Muslim. So it is into that world that we've got to see the future and the relations among the great powers. China does not want to take on the US as global hegemon. Not because they can't, but they think it is foolish. They think that to attempt to do it will lead to your own self-destruction. And they have ample examples in their own history that when they started interfering in the affairs of others, it will in the end boomerang back on them. The idea that American fleets should be in the Baltic, in the Black Sea, in the South China Sea, in the Sea of Okhotsk, wherever, they think, well, you can do that because you have the capability, but it costs you a fortune. And you can only do it now because you have the US dollar and the exorbitant privilege which comes to the US dollar. Nobody remember in the 60s, the Vietnam War, which was very expensive. And Johnson wanted to carry on with the Great Society program. So in the end, the US dollar had to be depegged from gold, and it led to horrifying inflation, which Paul Volcker later had to squeeze out at horrible pain to the entire world. They don't want to do that. In fact, in my view, they will never open the domestic capital market fully to London and New York. Because you do that, you lose control of monetary policy within the country. And China have always this belief that to preserve its homogeneity, and it's 92% Han, to preserve its homogeneity, you must always build walls around yourself. It can be a physical wall, it can be a capital markets wall, it can be a wall on Hollywood movies, on textbooks, and the most remarkable wall of all, in recent years, a biological wall that they built. You know, in the national anthem, which they sing every day, they talk about rebuilding walls. The Americans don't know this. They think that, like themselves, the Chinese are also a proselytizing missionary power. The Americans, when they come to Asia, sometimes it's cynical, but usually it's sincere. Their wish is for you to become like them. And they kept lecturing Lee Kuan Yew. He got so exasperated. So he said, make me a 51st state, and I'll follow your instructions. Then you look after me, you look after my defense. Now the question for Europe is this. You rely on the US for your defense, for your security. NATO, the Transatlantic Alliance. Is the EU, is that the foundation of the EU? Well, it's a big question in the future of Europe. What is European autonomy? It's not 1 or 0, but in which direction do you want to move? And what happens if the US turns inwards? Does this mean that you no longer have a foundation for European Union? So these are big issues. And the position Europe takes in the world will have a big bearing on whether we have peace or war between the US and China. Because if Europe, because of the Transatlantic Alliance, follows US policy on issues vital to China, particularly Taiwan, the likelihood of war goes up. But if Europe says, look, on these issues we agree with you because we are from the same civilization, but on those issues, no, then the Americans will be more circumspect and war becomes less likely. Because it's not triangular. It is bipolar with Europe somewhere at the fulcrum. And it can lean a little more to one side or the other and maintain stability. And if Europe does that, the transition to a multipolar world will be a much smoother one. But to do that, you need knowledge. It cannot be just the result of domestic electoral necessities. It cannot be the whim of political leaders who have no sense of history and little understanding of it. You need scholars, you need think tanks, you need Jesuits. This is very important because on the other side, they have their counterparts. And Taiwan is an issue so lightly played that is alarming to me. How European leaders, European countries say, oh, no, we love Taiwanese, we love Taiwan. They know nothing about Taiwan, but they love Taiwan. And they love to visit Taiwan, even though they can't remember the names and the places they visit. They do that in order to support the Americans and to satisfy themselves that they are being tough with China. Because China is too big, we've got to show that we are also strong. But Taiwan is a wrong card to play, because for the Chinese, Taiwan is a matter of historical justice. In the 1943 December, in Cairo, Stalin met Roosevelt, Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek. And in the Cairo Declaration, they make clear that Taiwan will be returned to China. In Potsdam, after the war ended in Europe, July 1945, it was Truman, and then halfway Churchill was replaced by Attlee because he had lost the elections in the UK, and Stalin. And they reaffirmed the Cairo Declaration in the Potsdam Proclamation. In other words, the status of Taiwan was long settled. During the Civil War in China, the American Navy helped the KMT to occupy islands in the South China Sea because the US accepted that those islands were part of China. They were occupied by Japan as a part of China. And so we returned to China. But now, because China is a preoccupation, many issues are being revisited, despite the history. But for the Chinese, Taiwan was lost because their fleet was sunk by Japan in 1994. And there was a humiliating peace agreement called the Treaty of Shimonoseki that year, leading to Japan taking over Taiwan and ruling it for 50 years. For China, it is not an issue which is negotiable. And any Chinese leader who takes a different position, however autocratic, will lose the overwhelming support of the Chinese people. Now, other issues you can talk about. You can talk about trade, you can talk about intellectual property, you can talk about chips. I think the Chinese can look after themselves. But on Taiwan, they will go to war. If they believe that the US intends to keep Taiwan separate, independent if possible, forever. The accusation is made that China is about to invade Taiwan, that Xi Jinping wants to do it for his legacy. This will not explain why in 2015 in Singapore, Xi Jinping, 2 years after he became president, met Ma Ying-jeou, the president of Taiwan in Singapore, as an equal. It was never done before. It was unprecedented. And it was done at great risk to himself. They had dinner at the Shangri-La Hotel. I was in the Quad group at the time, so I asked, who paid for the bill? I was told 50-50, down to the last cent, 50-50. Xi Jinping, of course, brought his 52% Mao Tai from Guizhou. Ma Ying-jeou, not to be outdone, brought his 52% Jingwen Gaoliang. Both very good liquors and very warm words exchanged. Now, Xi Jinping was not doing it for Ma Ying-jeou because Ma Ying-jeou was stepping down. He was doing it for Tsai Ing-wen, whom everybody knew would be the next president. I called on Tsai Ing-wen after she was elected, before she was installed. And she grumbled that the mainland was not forthcoming. I said, but Xi Jinping has just opened the road for you. It's not a superhighway, but it's a pretty good road. She kept quiet. She knew what I meant. But she would not take that road because even though she became president on the Constitution of the Republic of China, her own party constitution of the DPP, the first article says, our mission is to establish an independent republic of Taiwan. So when Western powers lightly encourage the DPP to flirt with independence, you're touching a live wire. It will have consequences. So while I do not believe that China wants to invade Taiwan lightly, I believe that China will move if they are convinced that Taiwan has embarked on the road to independence. China can abjure the use of force, any more than Madrid can abjure the use of force if Catalonia were to declare independence unilaterally. Any more than London can abjure the use of force if Scotland were to declare independence unilaterally, or even Northern Ireland. But because you do not abjure the use of force, so we can be polite to one another and negotiate peaceful outcomes. But the mood in the Western media, partly deliberate, partly reflecting the mores of the time, is to paint a picture of China which is very dramatic and very black, and is leading to wrong decisions being taken in Europe. And yet the decisions being taken in Europe will have huge consequences for the world, and of course, for Europe itself. So Alex, let me end here, and then we can have a conversation.